Hi, everyone. I'm just going to begin with an acknowledgement of country. In the spirit of reconciliation, Sisters in Crime New South Wales acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections with land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to the elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Thank you. Okay, we're going to do a bit of housekeeping to begin with. First of all, we've got to thank our wonderful speakers for being with us this evening. We're really pleased you're here. Sisters in Crime New South Wales also thanks all of you for attending and notes the reason you're only seeing Kate, Tia and I is not that we're gorgeous, especially with my blurry background here, but we're recording this event. So if your AV does something Halloween magic-like, please mute yourself and turn off your video. We will have plenty of time for questions. They will be typed into your Q&A panel, which is the one that's on the bottom bar on the right-hand side. Don't try to use chat, please use Q&A. I'll let you know when we're kind of opening the Q&A panel, okay? We're going to discuss tonight Tia and Katie's most recent books, but feel free to ask about any of their novels. I thoroughly enjoyed my recent Cooper Nunn Fest, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who'd like to know more about all of their books. I should note you can purchase their books through good independent bookshops or through Amazon on Booktopia. At the end of tonight's event, we'll draw 2 fabulous book boxes for those who've donated to the event, so hang on to your virtual tickets. And now I'm just going to briefly introduce the authors. But I need to use my piece of paper, sorry guys. Kate. Author and publisher Sophie Green says about Kate, several things are true about Kayte Nunn's novels. You will laugh, you will cry, you will learn something, and you'll be reluctant to leave the characters behind. This is incredibly true. Kate is the author of 6 novels, including the international best-selling The Botanist's Daughter, for which she was awarded the Winston Graham Historical Fiction Prize in 2020. Her 2021 novel, The Last Reunion, is meticulously researched and it's a thoroughly engaging mystery. Tia has an infectious fascination with the past, according to the Sydney Morning Herald, and they're spot on there. Tia has published 13 novels, several with highly successful international publication. In 2021, she won the Daphne du Maurier Awards for Excellence in Mystery and Suspense for The Cartographer's Secret, which I really enjoyed. The Fossil Hunter, her 13th novel, was released only a few days ago, and we're really privileged to be the first people to speak about it. And just FYI, I'm AD Penhall. I answer to Anne or Andy. I'm a psychologist who spent way too much time hanging around in correctional centres and with other people of ill repute. I've had a number of short stories published, and my first novel, Dangerous Devotions, is out earliest next year. Well, let's turn to Halloween. Thanks again, Tia. Thanks, Kate, for joining us here on Halloween, which, as you all know, is the night before the Celtic New Year. It's the night when the boundary between the worlds of the living and the dead becomes blurred and can dissolve entirely. We thank you both for bringing us 2 wonderful novels, both of which evoke ghostly reverberations of the lives and crimes of past people. But before we get to the haunting, I'd really like to just get a taster of both your novels. Tia, The Fossil Hunter is hot off the presses. So maybe we'll start with you. Could you give us a couple of paragraphs from the beginning? That would be great.
The story revolves around a fossil. A woman discovers at the London Natural History Museum. So her name is Penelope Jane, and she served as an ambulance driver during the First World War, and she's awaiting repatriation. Her trip to the museum is something of a pilgrimage. She last visited with her brothers before they enlisted. When she's shown an Australian fossil dating back to the 19th century, she recognises the place name, Bow Wow Gorge, the very spot her brothers had fossicked as young boys. In a fit of whimsy, she decides there might be something of significance in their dusty old collection of fossils at home in Australia, the perfect way to commemorate their lives. Her quest leads her back to the 19th century, to a world of scientific discovery and dark secrets.
Excellent. And Kate, could you give us a little taster of the last reunion?
The last reunion, that's kind of interesting because the last reunion also starts in a museum in London's Ashmolean Museum, where a rare Japanese net ski called the Fox Girl is stolen. And we learn through the book how this theft relates to the two stories which interweave, which are 5 women in the Second World War, Bee, Plum, Bubbles, Lucy, and Joy, meet up to go and serve as WASBs, the Women's Auxiliary Service Burma. And they are English women and women who have a background in the Far East in India, and also an Australian character as well. And they will be driving mobile canteens, trucks basically, through the monsoon rains, through the jungle, to serve char and wads, which is basically tea and cakes, and all kinds of necessary sundry items to the men serving there in Burma. And then in the present day, a young Australian art historian, really, is working for an art gallery in London, an art dealer, and she's called to go to the house of an old woman who wants to sell her collection of Japanese art. And the mystery unfolds from there.
Fabulous, thank you. And I think they're both really fabulous mystery novels. I really enjoyed kind of, just that kind of tension that goes through them. But we're going to talk about the ghost for a minute, if that's okay. In neither of the novels, there are no unearthly spectres, although in Kate's previous very popular novel, The Silk House, there's some pretty good ghostly moments. But one of the really interesting things about both The Fossil Hunter and The Last Reunion is there's dual narratives. In The Last Reunion, as Kate's just said, we're in India and Burma during 1944, 1945. And then we're in London and Galway chasing that net ski with young Australian art dealer Olivia. Whereas The Fossil Hunter's present time is 1919, so there's a bit of war in both, which is really quite an interesting overlap. And the past is 1847, firmly set in the Hunter Valley and that mysterious gorge. One of the great things that happens because of these two times is that in the present time story, the protagonists and us as readers hear very uncanny echoes of past lives. And there's a real sense with both of your novels that you're half hearing and half seeing connections between past and present, which is kind of definitely there's something in the air. So I'm going to ask a double-barrel question. Are you fans of the spooky? And more seriously, do you personally have a sense of the inseparability of past and present and possibly a future? Or do you create that as a way of beguiling us as readers, as a literary device? Katie, if you would start us off.
Certainly. I am a fan of the spooky, but I'm really easily frightened. I remember when I was writing The Silk House, and that is about hauntings and ghosts. And we were living in an old weatherboard cottage, and my daughters convinced me that we had a ghost in the house and we could hear her running up and down. And they even gave her a name. And that did freak me out a little bit, even something as silly as that. But in The Last Reunion, the main character, Beatrix, is definitely haunted by her past. She has a lot of unresolved things to deal with. And that inseparability of the past and the future is something that's really interesting to me in all of my books. And it's how, particularly an object from the past, because people are sometimes long gone, but that object is still there and still has an effect on the people in the present and has that extraordinary history. And I love the fact that, if buildings could talk, what have they seen in all of their history? And in terms of beguiling the reader as a literary device, I just think to set up a mystery, you need the reader to become invested in what did happen in the past and that slow reveal, as well as perhaps in the more contemporary strand, what's happening to unravel that. So yes to both questions.
Yeah. Well, it certainly works. I mean, you certainly want to keep going with that mystery, partly because there is that sort of half-seen stuff, and the haunting is really effective. So what about you, Tia? I mean, you do it too, and you both do it so well.
I'm definitely a fan of the spooky, absolutely. But as you say, it's the echoes of the past which fascinate me. And I think it happens all the time, you know, that lovely feeling of serendipity. You meet someone, you're immediately connected with them, or the sense of deja vu when you visit a place. And as Kate said, I particularly like the houses. Like I think houses carry a lot of vibes that go on from, and also, you know, there's paintings and old photographs. Old photographs pull me in every time. I've actually never thought of it as a literary device. Perhaps it's an unconscious one, but I don't sort of, it's just what fascinates me, and that tends to be what I write.
Well, I think it works though as a literary device, and I think there's quite a
accidental literary device.
Yes, I think there's something, you know, if we've got aspiring writers in the audience, of which most of us are one, I think it's a very fascinating and very interesting literary device to explore, particularly the way you've both worked it with that dual narrative kind of thing, because it just is such a lovely way of getting those echoes going. And because they're both told as if they're happening at this point in time, we feel very involved in each one. So it's a really clever and you know, very enjoyable way of writing. I'm going to change tack a little bit here, because we started off doing this particular session being really interested in the fact that we had two writers who wrote stories with lovely spooky and dual narratives who both lived in regional New South Wales. And so I've got to ask you a couple of questions about where you live. Kate, I'm going to start with you. I've gathered that you've had an itinerant childhood, which I also had. So I'm guessing you're fairly alert to differences in places and their effect upon you. So I'm going to ask, does where you write have an effect on your writing? And would you write differently if you lived in Sydney or London or Melbourne or Tokyo?
Well, some of my books were written when I was living in Sydney, but I don't think I would write differently. I like writing about places where I'm slightly an outsider, because, and my characters sometimes are as well, that it just gives them and makes them more alert to things that are going on, I think. And it certainly, for me as a writer, I used to be a travel writer, and so I've always loved writing about place.
Yeah.
And I try to, in my research, to visit those places, but don't always get to, and then it's an awful lot of research. So I did not get to Burma, but I figured it would have been very different in 1945 to 6 than it is now as Myanmar. But in terms of the research, I really try and focus on place and world building and creating that. So I don't think so. I do, because I live in Australia, try and include an Australian element to each of my stories, because I think it really grounds it. Maybe if I lived in London, that wouldn't be so important to me. So yes, that's you know, place is very important, but I don't see myself writing about particularly where I am living at the time.
No, but I think there's a sense that, I guess in a way what I'm asking is, you know, does the fact that almost just the ease, the practicality of being somewhere where there is space, and I mean, I'm now back living in regional New South Wales myself, and I have a bigger sense of time.
Yes, maybe, yes, and it's certainly more peaceful. That's for sure. Having lived next to a building site and written through that, this is much more enjoyable. Yes.
Yes, I was living with WestConnex in Sydney. It was a lot of fun. Okay, so Tia, I mean, place is obviously really important in your novels, and there's a lot of them firmly set in the Hunter Valley, and the cartographer's secret really springs to mind there. So you live in the Hunter. So I guess, is place the inspiration for your stories? Do you start with place? And can I ask the other bit, which is, and do you sometimes find yourself looking out for the ghosts of Evie and Olivia? I really like it.
I'll come to that in a moment. The whole reason for setting my books in the Hunter was that, I mean, apart from the fact I've always been fascinated in history, was when I retired, because I didn't start writing until I retired from the classroom, which we won't go into. I volunteered at the local museum, and I met a man by the name of Carl Hoipo. He's the local historian, and he likes nothing better than a glass of red and the opportunity to tell stories. But his major area of interest is the colonial history of the Hunter Valley. Oh, no, I'm not allowed to say that. I have to say of the old county of Northumberland.
Oh, okay.
The area that's marked in Mitchell's 1834 survey map of the 19 counties, and it's the area bound by the Hawkesbury, the Hunter, and the MacDonald rivers. So all of my stories, probably because of my initial meeting with Carl, are basically set in the county of Northumberland. There's the odd side trip to London and Cornwall and in the fossil hunter Lyme Regis, but they're the places of my childhood. But I really do like writing about places that I've been to. And I like to walk the paths my characters walk. You know, if I get stuck, which immediately brings me to your question about, do I see them when I go down the road to buy a pint of milk? Absolutely. And particularly with the fossil hunter, because I have to walk past the Wollombi Mill Pond, which features in the book, and the cemetery and the old doctor's house. So they're all real places.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's amazing. Yeah.
I did actually take a photograph that I thought maybe of the cemetery that I thought maybe I could use as a backdrop for this, but it just didn't work. So there is, however, only one character in one of my other books, Miss Elizabeth Quinn, who appears in The Girl in the Painting. And I am absolutely totally convinced, and this is nice and spooky for you, that I saw her walking through the streets of Maitland and into the Maitland Art Gallery before I started writing the book. And she was the inspiration for that story. I saw her sweeping down the road. You know? So yeah, both of those. So place, yes, place enormously important.
But I mean, I think that what works for both of you, or I had that sense particularly, so maybe it's just how I've responded to it, but I feel like the people you've got are really rooted in place. I mean, the women in the Wasbies in Burma, it's an entirely different place, but the place produced how they behaved, you know, and I got, well, I mean, I particularly liked Olivia in The Cartographer's Secret here. I was very fond of her. I want to grow up to be Olivia. You know, but she was a production of her place in a way. You know, she responds to place. So it comes across very strongly, I think, in both your work, that element of place, whereas in some, which is a, you know, wonderful aspect of crime novels, is that, and most of us here are crime readers, if not writers, is that place is so important to how you generate, you know, your forward momentum. So that was very enjoyable reading your books in place.
Thank you. Yes, and like Tia, I also use places from my childhood, having spent childhood summers in Cornwall, and then having been to Galway over New Year. That sort of, it becomes easy to imagine.
Yeah.
Try not to make it too hard for yourself.
And maybe there's also an echo of your past there, so it's kind of, you know, that kind of. So yeah, cool. I think that one of the things that when I've talked to people about both of your work, not about the Fossil Hunter Tia, because I'm one of the few people who's had the privilege of reading it now, but about the Cartographer's Secret in particular, and the last reunion, is that people have been amazed by these bits of history that they haven't known about. So for those of you who haven't read the books, we learn about the Wasbies, the Women's Auxiliary Service in Burma, in the forgotten war of Burma and the end of World War II, 1944, 1945. And in the last reunion, we get a real picture of the early involvement of women in paleontology. And Mary Anning is mentioned, and Mary Anning was a very important kind of figure in that. And so it's great to kind of get those bits of history there. And they certainly, the histories also haunt some of the characters in the novel to keep on with our Halloween theme, and they infuse the modern stories. but neither of you have pushed facts and interpretations on us. And I think this is a question that, you know, a lot of writers want to know the answer to. How on earth did you resist the temptation to show us all that research? Because you've done it. You know, how do you keep out the bits, and how do you choose the bits that you put in? So Kate, maybe if you could start us off.
It's a difficult question, actually. I think it's really about judgment and knowing what will be interesting and what won't, and really trying not to preach. I guess. And sometimes I do find myself doing it, but I know instinctively that that has to come out. In terms of researching the Wasbys, I really came across the story because I wanted to write about a friendship between a much younger woman and an older woman. And then I knew I wanted to write something about Nevsky because I'd always been fascinated by them since I worked in an art gallery as a temp years ago. And so I had those two threads, and then it was literally a case of getting on Google and thinking, well, when could I do it? I really didn't want to go back to Japan in the 18th century, particularly for this story. And that's where I stumbled across the Wasbys. And there actually wasn't a lot of information about them. So I researched as deeply as I could, but it wasn't necessarily really broad. And I was lucky enough to speak to one of the women who served in the Wasbys, who's still alive and lives in Melbourne. That was just incredible to get that kind of primary information. And also there had been a diary published. And then there were 2 pamphlets, and that was about it. So there was a lot of detailed information in there, but it wasn't like I could research for years and years.
So can I just ask, when you're doing your first draft, do you find you put more research in and then you take it out? I guess it depends on how you write, but...
Not really, no. Very occasionally I'll take something out because I think I am just pushing a point and it doesn't serve the story. But no, I research beforehand, and that can often give me some story ideas as well, and it did in the last reunion. But then I will, if I need to find out, well, what did they wear or what were they paid, I will research it as I'm going as well.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's very nicely modulated, shall we say, the research. And Tia, how have you done it? I mean, again, you've inserted those bits of research, just at times, and that goes on with a beautiful flow. So how do you stop yourself going, well, there's a good other bit here, I've got to put that in because they really should know about it?
I do suffer actually from an overload of information sometimes, mostly because of my friend Carl. And I live in fear and dread of the information dump. But I actually often include it in my first draft. I don't spend an awful lot of time writing it, but I dump it in the bit where it's relevant. And it also makes it fairly easily accessible, where I want, when I'm writing, I can go back and see what's going on. But then as the story comes together, it gets axed.
Right.
I mean, I really believe it's the salt and pepper analogy works perfectly, just enough to flavor it. And I'll actually, often go on taking out information dumps as I go, as the story gets, develops. But I like, it does inform, did Kate just say that? It does inform the story enormously. And it sometimes it can be, just a couple of words can make all the difference to painting the picture. But,
yeah. Well, I think that's when you start being a mature writer, is when a couple of words will do it. So perhaps that's a really good summary of the answer to the question. Sometimes a couple of words will do it. Yeah.
And you don't have to be super precise and spend hours going down a research rabbit hole, when really you can convey what you need to by being fairly vague about it. It's good to be specific sometimes, but you don't have to be, completely, obsessive about it, I suppose.
But those rabbit holes are such fun.
Yes.
I'm a bit of a rabbit hole girl myself, actually, but I mean, readers don't want to read the rabbit holes, and but sometimes you get stuck with them. So it's really good to work out how both of you haven't got us stuck with them. I think one of the things that also I said to Kate and to Tia, before all the rest of you were here, that I, quite honestly, across my heart, hadn't read their work before. And now I've read quite a bit of their work. And I've said to my book group, come on, let's do those. So we've scheduled them in. And I think one of the things that has been really appealing is that kind of mix of history and mystery. I hadn't realized they rhymed until I just started saying that, the history and mystery. And I think also then for us as a women's book group, it's that you've got those unknown pasts that we've got, the Wasbys, and I mean, I must admit I knew about Mary Anning, but paleontology and women, with really strong active female characters. And so I'm going to ask, do you actually think your books are part of or helping to promote in their own quiet and hopefully sometimes noisy way, a change in the way we view history, which is capital H? And if so, in what ways? Tia, if you could kick us off this time.
Well, I like the expression her story. I mean, it's, not his story, it's a hers. And I mean, history is always written by the victors, and in the past they were men. So women disappear. I do have a sort of a tick. If I make any of my female characters do anything, I like to, the main characters in my books are always fictional, or to date they have been. I am toying with the idea of another one, but that's another story. But I do, part of my research is to make sure that there was a woman of that period, not necessarily in Australia, but who did do what I want my characters to do.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, Mary Anning's the obvious, example. When I wrote The Cartographer's Secret, the initial idea for that sprang from the fact that I was, don't ask me why, I have no idea, back to rabbit holes. I was looking at some stuff by the Dutch cartographers, and I discovered that in the 15th and 16th century, most of them were women, and they worked in the family business, and their maps were signed by their husbands or their fathers.
Oh yeah, like the painters' apprentices.
Yes.
Yes, of course.
And I was outraged. So I was determined that I was going to find a way to have a woman who would sign her own map, hence The Cartographer's Secret. I mean, that's really where it came from. So, I do like to make sure that it's feasible. I think, even though they're fictional stories, I like to make sure that they're feasible.
And I think they are, to me, a really good way of shifting that view of history as his story. Because many people aren't going to read history. I mean, as I said, I'm a rabbit hole person. I totally love the internet. It goes everywhere. I can learn stuff. I love libraries. They go everywhere. I can learn stuff. But you can also pick up one of your books, T or Kate, and go, oh, here's a new piece of history. So, and there are new characters doing it, which I think is a really valuable thing to do. So what do you think, Kate? Do you think that there is a bit of a change that comes in the kind of concept of history through you writing your books?
Look, I think, like Tia, I choose fictional characters, but based on the exploits of real people, so that it has some truth there. And I'm really interested in telling stories of people who are overlooked and underestimated, and that's what really kind of gets the fire in my belly. And so it often is about women and untold histories. And for the last reunion, I was quite interested in the way that the idea of mateship in war has really been explored from a male perspective, but not necessarily from a female perspective. And I was really interested in writing about female friendship generally, in several different ways. So that was important as well. But yes, and I didn't want to write a Second World War story set in France or even in Italy. I did look at Italy. To me, I was really excited when I found something that I couldn't find anything that had been fictionalized about the Wasbys. And I actually wrote it really quickly because I wanted to get it written and didn't want anybody else to have the idea. So I wrote actually 50,000 words of the first draft 2 years ago during NaNoWriMo, which nearly killed me, but I had that desperation to get the story, for me to tell the story, and nobody else to come across the idea.
And now we're all involved in it, which is great. It's really great. And in both of your stories, you've created, oh my goodness, there's a sudden bit of sunshine's come into my room. Sorry about this, guys. I can't do anything about it. I'm in a house that's half renovated. I haven't got curtains here. So in telling your stories, one of the other things that, again, the people I've spoken with have really responded to is that they're multi-generational. Each of your books has characters who are older and younger and middle. So we're not actually focusing on one kind of age group, which is actually remarkably unusual in fiction. And you've really created older women that I'd love to have in my family. Bea in the last reunion, I'm totally in love with Bea. And Olivia, I'm totally in love with Olivia. In The Cartographer's Secret of my favourites. But, Miss Baldwin was pretty good as well in The Fossil Hunter, But how could you tell us a little how you've crafted those cliche-breaking women of 70 and 80 plus years? So, Kate, how did you come up with Bea, particularly the older Bea?
Yes. When I first started, the first germ of the idea for the story was this relationship between Olivia and Bea, and a kind of a May to December friendship, and a slightly batty old woman who is kind of a bit scared, but underneath it all, she's got a backbone of steel, and she's had a lot in her past that she's had to deal with, but she's now a bit of a frail old lady. But that kind of turns around through the course of the book, and she faces her demons essentially. And I love writing eccentric older women who, don't give a stuff about things. I think that makes them really much more interesting characters, I suppose. And they're fun to write because they've got a bit of personality. So that's where she came from.
She's great. And one of the really, I think, works incredibly well with Bea and Beatrix is that as Beatrix, as a young woman, you're actually in her deep third person. So you're really seeing things through her eyes. But when we see her as an older woman, we're kind of a little bit surprised by her. We don't know quite how to take her because we see her through the younger Olivia's eyes.
Yeah.
So at that literary level, it works really beautifully. And then she unwraps herself, I think, in that second part of the novel, where she sort of comes out of the egg as this older woman. It's very, very effective. It's a really good literary device.
Oh, thank you.
Really
it's funny, so much of what I do is subconscious or unconscious. It's not a definite thinking, I do this because this happens. It just seems to be, for me, the best way to tell the story.
That one is a really very clever unconscious move. Have a few more of them. It'll be good. and Tia, Olivia was such a delight. How did you get to her?
It's not terribly difficult writing 70-year-old women when you're my age. I've got lots of friends who provide wonderful role models, and I can draw on my own experience as well. So I really enjoy. I do enjoy writing older women, but I also enjoy writing much younger characters as well. And dual timelines are the perfect canvas for doing that. But I can't say too much more because it might be a spoiler alert.
Oh, okay. You sure you can't tell us a little bit more?
Well, it's just that they're in a dual timeline. You can have the characters who span both timelines, and I like the idea of knowing somebody as a younger person and then seeing them as they've gone through life's rich patterns and come out the other side, if you like. So yes, it's great fun. And I don't know, Olivia just happened. Actually, well, Anthea as well in the Fossil Hunter, they just sort of were there. They just, I don't know, they just turn up on the page.
Well, I think that kind of leads us really into the next question I have for you, which is something I really like about both books, is that your heroines do have pluck and glamour, no matter what age they are. And they're, they have a bit of Phryne Fisher in them, but there's no shying away from real life problems. And I think that's a real strength of the novels. They deal sensitively with abusive women. They have complicated relationships between children and parents in them. In Kayte's Last Reunion, we've got complexities in female friendships and lots more kind of, edgy stuff. So, Tia, if you could tell us first, do you consciously set out to deal with these deeper themes, or do they just arise somehow as you kind of write the characters and the actions, or as you're researching even?
No, I think they very much just arrive. Once I've got the idea for a plot, and I don't do a vast amount of plotting before I start writing, but I have to, one thing I have learned is that I have to write my way into the characters, and they sort of develop over the first few chapters, and I might write sort of about 20 or 30,000 words, and then I'll go back to the drawing board and flesh them out.
So would Melly, without doing any spoilers, would she have started in your mind before you wrote her with the issues, or the things that had happened to her, or would
that first chapter in the book, where Melly starts the book, and that was the first chapter that I wrote. And I mean, obviously it gets tweaked and tweaked and tweaked, but that was how she presented herself. And it sounds a bit fey, doesn't it?
No.
But yes, I have to get to know them, and I get to know them by writing that, a scene, maybe a scene that I chuck away, but that's the way I get into the heads and understand who they are. I did an interview with an American interview a while back, and it was about my book called The Girl in the Painting. And there's a character in there, Jane, who, a little like Melly, starts off fairly young, but not quite. Oh no, she's probably about the same age as Melly. But the interviewer wanted to know whether I had deliberately written her, or I'd written her on the spectrum, in inverted commas. But I didn't. I mean, it was just the way her character evolved, and she was a bit quirky, and she had a few foibles and this, that, and the other. But I didn't deliberately set out to portray her as a stereotype, perhaps. And I also think that I was thinking about this, when it's a historical, you don't want to get caught up in a modern classification, I don't think.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, so I've been musing on that quite a lot. But no, my characters just sort of, I guess I get to know them organically, probably. Throw them in the situation, see what happens. And you, Kayte, you're a plotter or a pantser?
I wish I could plot more effectively than I do. I start out with the characters and a landscape, a setting, and then I kind of write to find out what happens. I have an idea of a few kind of tent poles along the way and how it might resolve itself, but that sometimes changes slightly. But I knew before I started that I did want to write about female friendship. I had read Jojo Moyes' The Giver of Stars and loved that portrayal of female friendship. And so I was that was in the back of my mind definitely as something I wanted to explore. And I particularly wanted to explore the fact that female friendship isn't always, lovely and easy, and it can be difficult, but it still can be incredibly strong, and that actually it can be stronger than any kind of male-female relationships. And then in terms of themes that arose, the theme in the last reunion of what happens to Beatrix in Burma definitely came from a diary entry I read. I read a published diary of one of the women's experiences, and she describes being in a room with a soldier on her own and really having to do some fast talking to get out of there, and was upset by the fact that her friends laughed at her afterwards and didn't take it seriously when she was actually pretty scared. And I started to think, well, what if that hadn't turned out quite so well? And so that definitely in the research gave me a real turning point for the book. But often the themes come subconsciously and they arise as I write. And the characters, I like to go to sleep thinking about my main characters. And there's that lovely liminal space where you're half awake, half asleep. And then I wake up in the morning and I might still be thinking about them. I can be driving somewhere and then lines of dialogue will come into my head and they'll start talking to me as I get deeper into the book. So they definitely do come alive in my head anyway.
Well, no wonder there's a few ghostly echoes happening in your books. And I hope your driving's okay.
Yeah. Oh, yes, yes.
Very good. Okay, everyone, I'm just going to let you know, we'd really like to move on to some questions sometime soon. I've got one more I think we'll probably ask. So you're not going to use the chat, you're going to use the Q&A, which is on your bottom bar on the right-hand side. So you can start typing furiously now. That would be great. And in the meantime, I'm just going to ask another question about the dual narratives. I've found them really interesting. I found the way that both of you worked with those really interesting at the sort of literary level. So the two interlocking stories are presented sort of more or less as an A-B rhyming pattern, you know, and then they both tend to kind of merge when you actually get to the point where you're really solving the mystery. And so oddly enough, we're returning to, well, not oddly enough, but oddly enough, they return us to Halloween and that kind of stuff where actions and spirits sort of bleed across time and memories somehow merge and influence. So there's that kind of sense that the Celts had. So we're not talking Halloween that we actually kind of go out and buy in Big W or Kmart. We're talking Halloween, which was much more part of the folklore, where that sense that the past has an indelible but not really perceivable influence on the present and future. And that happens through those dual narratives incredibly well. So you get that real sense of it happening kind of in front of your eyes. So for the reader in your books, that all feels incredibly natural and seamless. But for you as writers, if, you know, Kate could start telling us, are there real perils and pitfalls in that structure? Are there advantages? And how on earth do you manage to keep it under control?
There definitely are pitfalls. And I've had, you know, you will always get readers who will be much more invested in one narrative strand than the other. And for me, it's been really important for each story to have its own arc and its own reason for being there and really be fully formed. And so when I start writing, I usually write one strand and then I'll complete that. And that's usually the historical strand. And then I'll write a more contemporary strand. And then once I've finished them, I will weave them together. And I often do that just by printing them out and stapling the chapters and see what works where. It's really important, I think, and I was teaching a workshop on this last weekend, and so I had some time to think about it. Things have to happen in each strand. And so that the reader becomes really invested, and you leave them on a bit of a cliffhanger, and then you go back, you return to the other strand, and so that they're desperate to know what happens in each, and it becomes this kind of snowball effect towards the end. So that's how I try and do it. And then the only thing I have to be really careful is that I don't reveal something in one story before it's happened in the other, and that can need a bit of kind of finessing and juggling towards the end.
Interesting. That cliffhanger thing really works, doesn't it? Because you've got the two strands. That's great. Teal, how about you?
I think the easiest answer is what she said. I really enjoy the challenge, and I also write the two timelines separately, but I don't write them in their entirety. I tend to jump from one to the other, but then that being said, I don't write any story chronologically, so I'm one of those people that writes the scene that comes into my head at that time. But usually, so I'm sort of juggling around, but I'm keeping them as two separate stories because as Kate said, it's really important to keep the story arc in both stories so that the reader stays invested. I do tend to make notes to myself, so that maybe at the end of the chapter there'll be something like you know, jump to the bit in the other timeline where Valerie discovers the line in the wardrobe. or something like that, so that once I've completed the first draft, sometimes the second draft, and I begin to interweave them, and I use that word as well as Kate did. I occasionally have a little bit of a roadmap that's sort of come to me as I'm writing it, if you like. But usually it works. Sometimes it takes a bit of juggling. Sometimes I find I've got too much of one story and not enough of the other, and the dreaded pitfall of making sure that you don't reveal something that you shouldn't have done too early. Oh, sorry, can I just say one more thing?
Yeah.
Somebody once described writing a dual timeline as a wine glass to me, which made an enormous amount of sense, because you've got two separate stories that run down either side of the wine glass, and then the most dominant story takes over, and it becomes the stem of the wine glass.
Oh,
and I find that, well, I'm a bit of a visual learner, but I found that incredibly helpful to me.
It's a very nice image from which to finish these questions, because I've got lots of people here in the chat room already. Oh, sorry, Q&A section, who want to know loads of things from you. So maybe we'll start with Alexandra, who'd really like to know, how do you balance creating the dialogue and the prose? Do you do that separately as well, or does it just flow? So Tia, you follow on with that, because that's in a sense what you've just been talking about.
No, I talk to that question, do I? I've just
if you wouldn't mind, can you?
No, that's fine. No, I absolutely don't write it. Well, no, actually, that's not true. I was going to say I don't write it separately, but that isn't true, because sometimes I will see the scene playing out and I can't type it fast enough. And I do tend to type the dialogue and then go in and layer the rest of the story in later on. But it very much depends on where I'm at the story, and it varies. But I still think it works, that you can, I think that the layering in is, I mean, it's no different to doing a second draft, really. So, if the characters are speaking to you, write the dialogue. If they're not, and you need to describe the place, because you can whack the dialogue in later. It's you have an option.
Okay, so you're definitely a pantser, I reckon.
I am, aren't I? I know, it's terrible. I always promise to plot the next one. Yeah.
I don't know, I think that's just a hang up from childhood, where somebody tells you that somehow that it's better to plan rather than do it intuitively. So I remember Sue Wolfe who's a very good novelist, saying, just write it, cut it up into little pieces, and then organize it, which I think, Kate, you were saying you do with your...
When I'm splicing the two timelines together. But for me, I can almost see it playing out like a movie in my head. And again, sometimes I can't get it down fast enough, but I might go back and maybe add a bit more description, because sometimes my editor will say, we actually need to know what she looks like or whatever, because I've forgotten to do that. And I might go back and just look at the dialogue, the action beats between the dialogue, to make sure my characters are moving around and doing things, just to sometimes break up the dialogue. So I might look at that. And in later edits, I might do a pass just for dialogue. And all I will concentrate on in the whole novel is just looking at the dialogue and making sure it's as sharp as I can possibly get it. But when I first start writing in a first draft, it's just as I see it happening in front of my eyes and my characters are talking to me.
So both of you are saying really that drafts are incredibly important in that process. So yeah, it's really true. Okay, I've got a question here from Rach. Rach is just asking quite simply, how long do each of you spend researching your work? For your work. Go, Kate.
I can start with that. Usually a couple of months to start with, to really kind of ground myself in the story and the era, and that kind of thing. And when I can see the first scene in my head, usually then I know it's time to start writing. But then I will research as I go. So I might need to look at a map and go, what street would they be walking along, and is there a hotel there, and what hotel could I use, or I might look for a visual of a house so that I can describe that house. So that research kind of happens as I'm writing, but I will spend a couple of months just getting to know things, and as I said before, sometimes the story element can come out of that research as well. But I don't research exhaustively for years on end. I don't have the time. I'm on a contract to write a book a year. So I usually have to get a move on.
It's a good contract. Must be good books. How about you, Tia? How long would you spend researching?
I have exactly the same issue with a book a year. So I've just finished basically what will be my 2022 book, if it's accepted. And I'm also at the same time thinking about the one that's going to follow on. So yes, I'll research enough for the scenes to start coming to me, for me to be able to see the story. It's also setting my books in the Hunter is really helpful actually, because there are an awful lot of things that I don't need to research anymore, because I know how long it took them to get the steamer from Morpeth to Sydney, whether it was an overnight steamer or not. So that's incredibly helpful. But there's always something that you don't know about. But I tend to try and write over it once I get into the writing, when, I have lots of things that say XXX, go back and check and see what time that happened and that kind of thing, or what did she wear, or, did they turn left or right, or whatever. So it's very difficult to quantify, actually.
I imagine it changes from book to book as well. But yes, congratulations to both of you on having the demand for your novels. I've got a comment here from Siobhan. She says, I was fascinated in both books about the descriptions of empty or old houses, run-down houses. I was myself, actually. And you've both said how you enjoy old houses. Have you had ideas for the story from particular old houses that you've explored? So go on, one of you.
I'll go.
You're both good talkers.
Because the house in the Fossil Hunter, I went out to ages ago. I went out to Parramatta to the MacArthur's house, and I can't remember what it's called. The farmhouse out at
Elizabeth Farm.
That's it. Thank you. And that was, I didn't use it, but it was buried somewhere. And then when I wanted, I'd read somewhere that they had tried to recreate an English farmhouse, or that Elizabeth Farm was supposed to do that. And then because in the Fossil Hunter, Anthea had come from England, it seemed the perfect place to put in this little bit of research that I've got stored away. Mm-hmm. But the Hunter is full of the most beautiful old houses, so I do spend quite a lot of time getting sidetracked.
Yes. For me, I love old houses, and the kind of the idea for the story in the Silk House came about really when I was visiting the town where I spent my teenage years in England, a town called Marlborough, and it has a restored silk merchant's house that used to be, I think, the newsagents or something, and now you can go in and they've sort of recreated it how it used to be, and that I was just like, well, there has to be a story there somewhere. And then there is a boarding school in that town, and one of the houses they now use as a boarding house was it used to be a small hotel where I worked as a chambermaid when I was in 17 or 18. So definitely those kind of old houses, and I really think old houses have an energy about them. And there's an imprint of what might have happened in the past there. So yes, definitely story ideas have come from visiting places. And then I went to the quarantine the quarantine station in Manly in Sydney, and then again there were certain places that really I felt incredibly uncomfortable. I did like a ghost tour, a nighttime ghost tour, and there were places I really didn't want to be because the energy there was terrible. But that sort of stuck in the back of my mind, and I ended up using a little bit of that kind of idea of things in the Silk House. So yes, old houses are definitely a firm favourite.
Second that.
Yes, they are pretty good. Darry wants to know, how difficult is it for you to write a male point of view, if and when you do? Now, Tia, you've got probably a little bit more of a male point of view in your books, I'd say, but iffy. Anyway, would you like to kick that one off?
I write the male point of view, but I always pass it over to a beta reader to read it, from a male to read it, and ask them. Way back, my very first book that I wrote, I was part of a writing group then, and we had to read out a bit that we'd written, and there was a guy, his name's Maximilian, in that group, and he just sort of rocked back and looked at me, and he said, "Guys don't think like that." And so I've been very conscious of it ever since.
That's a really simple and clever way of dealing with it, which I don't think I've ever thought of. What about you, Kate?
I haven't ever written a story from a male point of view. There are lots of men in my books, but I've always preferred to concentrate on a female point of view. I just think I understand it a bit better. Not to say I might not in the future, but it hasn't arisen yet.
Yeah. I mean, there's a load of interesting questions about authenticity there, but I think, Tia, you've come up with the kind of perfect solution in a way, so that's great. Sarah's asking, are there any tips for balancing editing one book while working on the next, and having children and running a farm and various other things that you're probably doing at the same time? Kate, you've got kids still, haven't you?
I do, yes. I have school-age children, and somebody else has asked, how do we stay in the zone? And that's been extremely hard during lockdown, because even though my children the youngest one is 11, I still get lots of interruptions. That is very frustrating. So my productivity is definitely down in the last 6 or so months. But balancing editing one book, I tend to do it in blocks. So I will leave what I'm writing as a first draft if I've got an edit coming in, and I might spend 4 to 6 weeks on that. And only then do I go back. I don't try and kind of juggle it all at once. I need to keep my head in one space. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I do.
Yeah. Tia?
Absolutely. Yes. I just have to put the new one away and go back to the edits and just not think about it. I have been known to muddle up the names if I try and be smart and do 2 things at once.
Speaking of that, there was a question I wanted to ask just about the characters, because they are very strong characters in both your novels. And I mean, I asked Tia about the ghosts of characters past as she's driving around the Hunter. But do you have a favourite character, and do you feel that you still want to keep some of those characters even though you've moved on to another book? So will some reappear at some point in time? What do you think, Tia? Yeah.
I don't think I'll ever have any of the main characters reappear. I do amuse myself slightly because it's more for my benefit than the reader's benefit, because the books are set very much in the same area. In the Cartographer, there's a solicitor in the Cartographer who actually was also in the Naturalist's Daughter. So they're sort of very minor characters who drop back in. But as I say, it's more for my amusement, I think, than the reader's amusement. I'm not sure that they even notice. And in the woman in the green dress, there's a hotel manager in Sydney, and he's reappeared in the story that I've just finished, but just the name of the hotel and the guy's name.
So you sort of Alfred Hitchcock moment.
Yes, it is. Absolutely Alfred Hitchcock. Yes.
Oh, very nice. And you, Kate, are you going to...
For me, no, I think I've told my character story in that novel, my main character, and don't really have an ambition to revisit it. And usually by the time a book is ready to be sent off to the printer, I've had enough. I don't want to it is sometimes hard to let them go, but it's like, no, I really need to move on. And so usually my favorite character is the one I'm writing at the time, because I'm really invested in their story.
It's interesting though, and if you go back to what Sophie Green had said about how hard it is to leave your characters behind. I mean, I still feel like, having read a number of your books and Tia's books over the last few weeks, that I've got this sense of your characters still kind of around me a bit. So your readers are keeping your characters.
That's lovely.
So we're looking after them for you. Okay. So if you do need to revisit them, I think you could just ask us and we'll go, okay, yes. We'll have a vote on which one we'll take on.
And I think it's really important as a writer to have the characters live on in the mind of the reader and have them wondering, oh, I wonder what happens next to them. Yes, you have a satisfying conclusion, but their life, it essentially can go on, and the reader can kind of imagine that for themselves.
Yes. Yes, well, there are some good ones there I've enjoyed. Now, Siobhan's got another question for us, particularly to Kate. She said, I loved the cat in the last reunion. I'm a cat person too. It reminded me of Red Lead, a cat with the Australian soldiers on the Burma Railway. Have you read that story?
I haven't, no. I will go and search in search of that. What surprised me when I was researching, and I found some photos as well, was that the women did have these pets. They had cats and dogs and this whole kind of menagerie, this traveling circus almost. And so I was, and for me it was also a way, and this really only evolved as I wrote it, a way of showing a change in a character and a character becoming a bit more sympathetic. And the vehicle of kind of, literally saving the cat was, which kind of made me smile to myself as well, because there is a very well-known writing book called Save the Cat, and it's about making your characters, a bit more sympathetic. But it was true. They had these pets, and I found that extraordinary. That they were moving from place to place, and yet they still had some of the comforts of a normal life.
Well, I mean, as a psychologist, one of the things that has happened in the recent years is the use of companion animals, and it's been incredibly effective. So kind of, intuitively, that's kind of what you're doing. You're saying that people are better off and feel better with a companion animal. Yeah. And dogs, of course, Tia, you've got that wonderful dog, Oxley, that just keeps on living forever and ever. Can you tell people a little bit about that dog?
The reason Oxley keeps on living forever and ever is that in my childhood, when we spent a lot of time in Cornwall, there was an old army colonel who used to walk on the beach with his dog, and it was called Bang, and he used to shout up and down the beach, which was, everybody thought it was terribly funny. But I went back 10 years later and the same dog's still there. But it wasn't, obviously, it just had the same name. I think people do that so they don't have an accident and call the dog the wrong name.
For those of you who haven't read the books, Oxley, I don't know how many generations there would have been of him by the time we meet him, but he would have had at least 4 or 5 generations of being named Oxley, and Oxley's a very strong presence. So you get very fond of Oxley. I'm more of a cat person than a dog person, but this particular dog is very kind of, has a real presence.
He likes egg sandwiches.
Yes, he likes egg sandwiches. I'm not sure a dog would. Amy would like to know, and I think this is a good question. I would like really probably to expand a little on Amy's question because it's a great one. Her question is, do you have any authors you love to read? And I think we'll expand it a little bit and ask a bit like, dear Kate Evans and Cassie McCullough on the bookshelf, who's on your bookshelf behind you? What are the books that you would say are seminal to you?
Oh, seminal books, that's a bit tricky. I can tell you some of the ones I've read recently that I've really loved. I'm a massive fan of Sarah Winman, and she's actually just written a historical novel called Still Life, set in Italy, and she's a beautiful and emotive writer. And then I also read a book by Claire Chambers called Small Pleasures, which is set in the 1950s, and it's a really beautifully researched story of a woman living a life of real quiet desperation. So that really got me emotionally. I do love to read crime. I love a good whodunit, and my husband and I both read the same books and read them one after the other. And he particularly likes crime. I've just read Anna Downs' The Shadow House and really enjoyed that. But I read widely and really varied, anything from very commercial fiction to literary fiction to crime and all around. Yes, and I it's nice because it feels like work, but it's not work.
So were there any books in your childhood you would say, you know, where you're a Jane Eyre fan,
Oh,
for
yes,
example,
yes.
that you kind of go, oh yes, that I would always have a
Yes,
copy
and
of.
I still have my childhood books, and I have The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you know, A Little Princess, and Jane Eyre, and all. Yes, definitely, and they're still, you know, they're falling apart now. The Little Prince was one of my favourite books, but I'm trying to think. What was the second part of your question?
Well, it was that what are the books that are on your bookshelf? You know, those ones that you're never going to throw out.
Oh, I read a lot of poetry as a teenager. I was quite an angsty teenager, and I actually really think as a writer that's a brilliant thing to do. It gives you such a feeling for language and for cadence and for word choice, and I think that's made a massive difference in making me the writer that I am, definitely.
Okay, everyone go out and read more poetry. I think that's a fabulous idea. What about you, Tia? Do you read poetry, and what's on your bookshelf?
I used to read a lot of poetry. I read shopping lists. I read everything, but I want to slightly change it because I'm in the last reunion. I've been reading a bit of Kayte Nunn lately. In the last reunion, I think it's B packs up her suitcase with some books.
Yes.
And I just sort of thought, well, that's ridiculous. I'll just go to the bookshelf. I could take every single one off. And what do we have? We had Gone with the Wind, The Hobbit, Murder in the Cathedral, and a couple more. I can't remember. Who were the others?
I had to make sure they were books that were published at that time, that
Yes.
had been previously published. So I researched that. And actually in my research about the Wasbys, they did have this travelling library and they lent books. And it was also, I wanted to make that part of her character, that she was quite bookish as well.
Yeah, no, it made me smile enormously. I have everything, yes, on my bookshelf going back to the Hans Andersen illustrated book that my grandfather gave me for my 5th birthday or whatever, and onwards. I can't throw them away. I mean, I don't have a garage anymore because I turned it into a library. It's not terribly exciting, but I really do like Lord of the Rings. I constantly tell people that the only genre I don't read is fantasy. But if I'm asked what my favourite book is, I think I have to say Lord of the Rings. I probably read it once a year, so that's rubbish. I just read books. Read a lot of poetry while I was at school.
And I think that, you know, often in writing courses, people will not really, you know, that thing of what you read, and they're sort of, oh, I don't know, but that is the thing a writer must do, is to just read. It's so, I mean, apart from the fact you have so many other worlds that you get, which is so wonderful to have. It's the thing.
And look, I think a lifetime of reading, and I was also an editor, so I was editing other people's work. It's that whole idea of 10,000 hours of practice, and reading is part of that. You know, you have to have that as a background if you have any hope of making a career as a writer, as a novelist.
Yes, I think that's a very good last word. I've got no more questions here, which is probably quite good time-wise. But if anybody does want to ask a question, you can quickly type it in while I'm going to I just have to get my piece of information because I've moved away from where I was sitting because of the terrible lighting. I'm going to ask Kate and then Tia to choose a number, and the person who has that number against their name is going to win a book box. And in that book box, there will be not a huge, but a selection of books, including at least one from Kate and or Tia. So you will get a really good opportunity to have a good taste if you haven't had one, or really stick your noses in if you've already had one and you just know that you're going to enjoy it a great deal. So Kate, if you could hang on 2 seconds, very rude of me.
Right.
Probably really undone, but this is a Zoom thing and that I could do it in a real life one. I've got my little list now. So Kate, if you could close your eyes, think deeply and come up with a number between 1 and 50, that person will win a book box.
All right, I will go with number 7.
Number 7 is Lulu. Lulu, I have your email and I'm going to send you an email to get your address, and we shall get you a book box. So congratulations, and thank you for donating to Sisters in Crime. Your money will go to support Australian women writers and interviewers, journalists. So Tia, the same task for you. Close your eyes, think deeply, and come up with a number between 1 and 50 that isn't 7.
I wanted to say 54, but since I haven't got a 54, I better go with
lovely number.
I will go with 44. I will go with 44.
44 is Sarah, who I think has, I don't know if it's Sarah who's asked a lot of questions, so I'm going to have to give a last name irrespective of privacy. It is Sarah Ross. And Sarah, I also have your email, so I shall email you to get delivery instructions. Okay, I now will just wrap up with a very heartfelt thanks to both of our wonderful speakers. It's been an absolute delight to meet you both. It's been a delight to read your books. It's been a delight to see that people are really interested in asking questions of you. And I certainly hope we get another opportunity to speak. And I really have it's been a great pleasure.
No, thank you, Anne, and thank you, Tia. It's been a lovely way to spend an hour.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it very much, and it's nice to meet you both.
Yes.
Yes. And thank you to our audience, and I hope you all have a happy Halloween. Thanks, guys. Bye.